Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, co-hosted by Sadali & Co. and Ropes & Gray. Today, we will work through several topics as we prepare to 2025. We'll begin with a brief recap of the 2024 proxy season, including notable trends and takeaways, before pivoting to regulatory developments and their various impacts on reporting in the near future. Finally, we will then work to tie it all together as we look towards fall institutional engagements and prepare for the 2025 year ahead. Before we get going, I'd like to do a brief round of introductions. To start, Sadali & Co. is a global organization dedicated to building stakeholder capital by combining capital markets intelligence and a unique blend of shareholder services, corporate governance, sustainability, and strategic communications to clients globally. I'm Greg Rapucci, a Senior Director of our Corporate Governance team, where we advise clients on shareholder expectations on various corporate governance, executive compensation, and sustainability-related topics. I primarily support our clients on disclosure development, preparations for engagements, and responses to investor inquiries, as well as navigating the shareholder proposal landscape. Prior to Sadali & Co., I held various sustainability-related positions in corporate and academic settings. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Joanne, to introduce herself.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everyone. My name is Joanne Chia. Do feel free to call me Jo. I'm looking forward to spending time with everyone. I'm sure a lot of us here today, are busy kicking off next year's, proxy season preparations. I'm part of Sadali's corporate governance consulting group, and together we provide our clients with strategic advice and proxy support year-round. So I've been practicing corporate governance for the past 25 years, and included in there is about 7 years in the institutional investor stewardship space, where I joined Fidelity Investments proxy research team, helping them establish executive compensation policies, pay for performance frameworks. This is generally applied to the various stakeholder groups within the enterprise, such as their ESG teams and the asset managers. In my role as a fiduciary, I was also the governance lead for Fidelity's equity holdings in the tech sector. And interestingly, when pandemic struck, I acquired adjacent responsibilities in governance responsibilities in the institutional SPAC investments. So it's very interesting times. In my earlier years, I spent it with ISS in various capacities and have had the opportunity to head their executive compensation team. In this role, I primarily oversaw the full cycle research process, covering 7,000 US recommendations across all the sectors, policy formulation, and conducting their investor roundtables. So I'm happy to share that all these roles have fully prepared me for my real job, which is really being a mom to a delightful 12-year-old who just started middle school. So I'm also excited to say that we're equally joined by our colleagues at Ropes & Gray. Michael, I'll pass it over to you for introductions.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. And also, Greg, pleasure to be here with everybody today. So Ropes & Gray, we're a law firm of more than 1,600 lawyers. We have offices in the Americas, Asia, and Europe. Mark and I are both based in our New York office, which has a little over 500 lawyers. Our ESG practice is one of the oldest formal practices in the space. We've had a branded formal ESG practice for more than 8 years, although we've been practicing in the ESG space for a lot longer than that. We have more than 300 clients we work with specifically on ESG, and we have more than 40 lawyers that are part of the ESG practice, spending either full-time or a significant portion of their time in the space. And those lawyers include lawyers in all of our principal geographies. In terms of my background, just briefly, I'm the global head of our ESG, CSR, and business and human rights practice, and I've been practicing in this area and its antecedents for my entire career, so more than 30 years now at this point. And my background comes out of the public company side. So for my entire career, I've worked with public companies on corporate governance, on ongoing reporting, stakeholder engagement, among other things. Mark, over to you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Mark Rotter. I'm a counsel at Ropes in New York. Similar to Michael, my background is as a securities lawyer, which fits well with ESG work and ESG disclosure, which has become an increasing part of our practice as a firm and of my practice personally. I think I'll keep the introduction short so we can jump right into the agenda.
Yeah. Great, Mark. Maybe I'll start us off then on the agenda. Thank you. So Greg and Joanne, we thought maybe we could start with a recap of the 2024 proxy season. It's in the rearview mirror, but not too distant at this point. But I think it's timely to be talking about 2024 since companies are now starting to prepare for 2025. And maybe we can start with your overall sentiment from this year's proxy season. How would you assess the year in hindsight? Are there any key observations or themes that you would want to share?
Thank you, Michael. Greg, I can take a first stab. Happy to share the big picture here. Most of us has just emerged out of proxy season, and this is a great way to level set our conversation this afternoon. So taking a step back, I think most of us started off the year, right, asking, taking a temperature in virtual meetings. So we've seen a height of about 4,000 companies doing virtual meetings during the pandemic year. And really, there's just really been a tepid decline. This year in Proxy 2024, we have observed 3,000 US companies still maintaining that forum. So at that backdrop, I encourage our audience to think about this data point within the broader context of the year's voting trends. There is a shift now on investors, shareholders being comfortable in this forum. So where are they shifting their attention? So let's take a look at director vote support this year. In 2024, investor expectations and demands on the board have grown very complex in the last few years, as all of us know, yet director support has remained remarkably steady. It's holding up at the 97 support level for both Russell 3000 and the S&P 500 for Proxy 2024. This number in context to the last 5 years is virtually unchanged. So while board expectations continue to evolve each year, we're meeting either diversity expectation, overboarding concerns, specialized skills from our boards. Evidently, the companies have risen up to a challenge and they're learning to use their proxy statements in a very substantive way to communicate the facts and circumstances, helping their investors navigate their wide-ranging views. In complete juxtaposition to the director trend, however, there is a large shift in say and pay voting behavior. In 2024, it marks the first year that we saw the lowest number of pay programs failing to achieve majority support. So only 27 companies have failed this year. And by any measure, this is the lowest point since the inception of say on pay in the US market. So for context, this is tracking 2 times lower than 2023 and 3 times lower than 2024. So on a broader trend, we're seeing now, if we take a closer look, the voting results today actually more prominently reflect your company's investor base more nuanced approach. They are now using this, what otherwise is a routine meeting event, to more constructively engage with their portfolio companies. So very interesting things there. Of course, a proxy year is never complete without taking a look at the shareholders' proposals landscape. Greg, you have any observations you want to share?
Sure. Thanks, Joanne. So again, this year we saw a high volume of shareholder proposals. I believe this was another record year for the number of proposals submitted to U.S. companies. Relative to last year in particular, the withdrawal rates was pretty consistent. We found that for the most part, a group of proponents were still willing to negotiate, and this is something that we see as a kind of a return towards a more normal trend, where a few years ago when proposal support was high, it was actually a little bit more difficult for issuers to negotiate with certain proponents. We did see this year a slight increase, but it was an increase in the number of proposals that received no action relief from the SEC. That is a positive development for the issuer community, given that it was very difficult to receive no action relief the last couple of years. This obviously is not at a level that's similar to the previous administration, but it's still, I think, a positive development for the issuer community. In terms of support, I think we've all seen that various institutions are starting to put out their voting records. We've seen press releases around this and news articles around this, that shareholder support levels remain low this year, particularly on environmental and social issues. Important for us, though, we don't see this necessarily as a material shift in institutional investors' sentiment. We actually see this as a combination of factors that really drive this lower level of support. First and foremost, the issuer degree of transparency, their disclosures relative to a few years ago when this proposal support was incredibly high, has very much been enhanced. And so we have to give credit to the issuer community for improving their transparency and disclosures on various issues over the last couple of years. Similarly, we have to give credit to our institutional investors where they have a greater appreciation for some of those company nuances, not only driven by the transparency that the issuer community has provided, but also by the resources that have been invested from these investors into their stewardship teams to really be able to actually track the 3,000 some odd companies that they're looking at on an annual basis from a voting standpoint. And finally, the shareholder proposal landscape does continue to evolve. So we did see a number of proposals again this year that were just viewed as overly specific, too narrow in scope for most institutions to really see a material reason to support. And combining that with the disclosure and the resources that the institutions have, it was really something that we were able to manage. Having said that, we did see a couple of proposals receive majority support. There were at least 2 climate-related proposals that received majority support, as well as a few political contributions-related proposals. Those were really driven by lack of disclosure from the issuer where those proposals were voted upon. In terms of topics, I'll just briefly touch on this. Climate-related initiatives, again, was something that was very much of focus. We did see a slight resurgence in the number of packaging-related proposals that went to vote this year, as well as a slight resurgence in animal rights, something that we hadn't seen in a couple of years. Biodiversity, we did see a couple of proposals come through, which we were anticipating, right? Over the last couple of years, we saw the launch of the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We also saw the launch of the Nature Action 100. And in a few weeks, they'll be releasing their first benchmark assessment. So with those launches, naturally, there was some additional interest in biodiversity this year. That's a trend that we would likely see move forward in the coming years. On the social side, just two key developments. There was a lot of focus on various labor practices again this year, whether that was workplace harassment, some interest in collective bargaining transparency, as well as some proposals related to living wage or benefits for employees. We also did see some new proposals on artificial intelligence, particularly in the tech space, but there were a few in other industries as well. Similarly, would anticipate that something to move forward on. And lastly, we did see a decline in the number of racial equity audit proposals that were submitted. And that's largely driven by a number of companies that had already made commitments to conduct or had already disclosed the results of their racial equity audits as a result of some of their commitments several years ago in response to the unrest and the events with George Floyd. Lastly, and I know we'll touch on this a bit more, but it would behoove me not to mention it now, anti-ESG proposals were a trend that we continued to see this year. There was a larger volume, about 50% more than last year. And it's something from a voting standpoint is not necessarily a material risk, but it's certainly something from a strategy standpoint that companies have to very much be focused on. And I know we'll be touching a bit more about that later on in this session.
Great, thanks. Really informative, a lot of great stats there. So, a lot of proposals, but it also sounds like kind of peeling all this back, that institutional investors overall seem to be more constructive this last year. So what does that mean for companies and boards going forward into the next proxy season?
Yeah. So if we take that conversation on say on pay, for example, right? We notice for the first time failure rates have fallen to single digits. So really, there are only 5 S&P 500 companies that failed to receive majority support as we speak today. So the fewer say on pay failures may appear momentarily encouraging, but the intensity of investor dissent is very interesting, though. We are now seeing new low watermark vote come out of Say on Pay in this space. So institutional investors are demonstrating a more constructive approach when engaging with their portfolio company, choosing really targeting when to vote against and being able to more effectively balance the various governance considerations when judging pay for performance, pay design, leading to a more measured approach, perhaps, but a more committed voting approach. So, we are seeing a lot more of companies actually these days of different um, cap sizes, life stages, proactively building investor outreach programs into their annual routine proxy process. This kind of creates a comfortable space to kind of hear out investor sentiments, calibrating company decisions prior to those board meetings. Recent outcomes have now established that S&P 500s are not immune to receiving this extremely low failure rate. So, this was unimaginable a few years before. So, they've become more proactive as well. Encouragingly, it's interesting to see institutional investors appear to be reciprocating as well in this dynamic. They're offering a bit more color, a bit more nuance in their public policy, often publishing, in fact, voting opinions. So this productive dynamic is really built at the backbone of this healthy exchange of viewpoints between the corporate issuers and investors. And this allows us overall a reasonable heads to prevail before an incident occurs. And we're seeing that play out in the vote outcomes. Greg, you touched upon, interestingly, the low votes on shareholder proposal. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Definitely. And I think you touched on something that I think is really important around how a lot of issuers are trying to take advantage of a year-round expanding the proxy season, taking advantage of fall engagements. And I think what we've seen in the voting spaces is, obviously companies are not going to be immune to someone taking a soundbite and trying to spin it in a way to benefit them and potentially adversely impact a company. And there are sound bites that I've probably made already on this webinar that someone could take and use in one way or another. But what's important is where we are in this environment is that the engagements with institutions allows for issuers the opportunity to mitigate the risk of impact of those potential adverse events, where institutions are looking to engage with issuers to really seek to understand how companies are approaching certain environmental, social, and governance issues, what their perspective is, maybe what they may not be able to achieve on paper, but what they're still working towards. And that's really important ultimately to be able to manage some of these proposals. Similarly, from an issuer side, it's important to have these conversations with your institutions to understand what it is that they're looking for. So you can take it back to the board, take it back to your management team, have those conversations around, okay, what can we work towards to address these issues? So if we were to ever receive a proposal on one of these topics, we could be in a better position to, demonstrate that we've been working with the investor community, with our stakeholders, to really address what they're focused on. And that obviously is something that has to happen regularly, because this is an evolution, right? Expectations will continue to evolve, whether that's a result of, company disclosures or, Michael and Mark, I'd love to maybe pass it to you to talk around some of the regulatory developments of, as the regulatory environment shifts, as issuers are required to disclose additional information as a result of that, that's naturally going to impact what institutions may be looking for, what the broader stakeholder community may be looking for. So would love to pivot to you and maybe ask, obviously this past year, we've seen a number of events unfold, right? We've seen CSRD continue to move forward. We've seen the SEC release their climate rule. Now it's in court. We've seen this climate rule be voted upon, and then a second vote around whether or not it should move forward with the timeline. So I would love to pass to you, and there's a lot going on. What are the things that issuers should really be focused on as we look to the next several months?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a topic we've been working with a number of companies on, because there is a lot coming online in the next few years. So you mentioned CSRD. It's a Europe-wide directive that will probably be the most extensive mandatory requirement that will apply to companies. And it will affect a large number of multinationals that are based in the US, including those that don't have any securities that trade on public markets in Europe. So companies, including US-based multinationals, that have a European subsidiary that exceeds two of three, relatively low turnover, revenue, or employee thresholds, would generally need to start preparing CSRD reports that would be published in 2026 for financial year 2025. So not that far off into the future. CSRD requires extensive information regarding a large number of sustainability matters. It goes well beyond just climate disclosure or matters that are required to be disclosed in SEC reporting. To determine what needs to be disclosed under CSRD, companies need to conduct a double materiality analysis, meaning they need to consider meaning they need to report on topics that are either financially material to the company or where the company has a material impact on the outside world. And that second piece is a very different way of thinking about disclosure than how one thinks about things such as, for example, SEC reporting. And it can be a fairly detailed and extensive process for companies to go through and get their heads around. In addition to doing the double materiality analysis, or really even before doing it, companies need to conduct a scoping exercise and think about first which entities need to report under CSRD, and then if the enterprise wants to have each of those individual entities report, if it wants to try to take advantage of a transition provision to report at a Europe-wide level, or if it wants to start preparing reports at a consolidated global level. All of that takes time and requires significant thought and discussion. It's a process worth beginning now. A number of other non-US jurisdictions are also adopting ESG disclosure requirements, including many based on ISSB standards. So, for example, Australia recently adopted disclosure requirements based on ISSB standards, which again can capture Australian subsidiaries of multinational companies. The takeaway is really that it's important for companies to ensure they have someone thinking about these issues on a global basis, both to make sure they're preparing for all the relevant requirements and that they have a system and a plan in place to sort out what needs to be done, collect data, and produce disclosure that can be subject to third-party assurance, which is a feature of many sustainability disclosure regimes, including, for example, CSRD. Even beyond that, at kind of a higher level, it's important for companies to generally make sure they're producing information in an efficient manner and telling a consistent story globally. I mean, as came out of the discussion a moment ago about ESG proxy matters, this is stuff that investors and other stakeholders are reading and care about. And you want to make sure that you're telling a consistent narrative across an institution. Back in the USA, California has 3 new disclosure requirements that are coming on, all focused on climate issues. So beginning in 2026, US companies with more than $1 billion of revenue that do business in California will be required to start publishing climate financial risk reports based on either the TSF, I misstated that. Starting in 2026, companies with more than $1 billion in revenue will need to start reporting their greenhouse gas emissions in California, including Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. We're still waiting on regulations implementing that requirement, which, pursuant to a new piece of legislation recently signed by the governor of California, won't come until next year, in the middle of next year. Companies with more than $500 million of revenue that do business in California will need to start producing TCFD reports or similar climate financial risk reports using a different standard, such as the ISSB standard. And finally, California also adopted a new piece of legislation called the VCDMA, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Disclosures Act. That requires disclosures by people that market and sell voluntary carbon offsets, but it goes much further than that and will require website disclosure by companies that make certain claims about carbon emissions. That extend far beyond just companies that utilize voluntary carbon offsets. Finally, and as you mentioned earlier, the SEC adopted a climate disclosure rule last spring. It requires extensive climate-related disclosures, though in many respects less than what's required by other regimes like CSRD. That rule, as I'm sure everyone listening knows, was challenged immediately after being adopted. It is currently subject to a stay while litigation is ongoing. And I'll stop monologuing there, but that's just a short summary. There are a number of other disclosure regimes in the ESG space that are also online or under consideration.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. You see my head nodding there vigorously, right? Because I can relate from personal experience when I used to do UK compensation, where the UK market was the proponent of say on pay, and then it came to the US shores. So, so it does seem like a lot of moving parts on the ESG disclosures, the ESG regulations. My conundrum has always been, in the US market right now, it's a patchwork of reporting standards. There's really no there's really no one unified way to go about this. So really, I'd like to ask on the practical point of view, how should companies really be navigating this uncertainty when you talk about readiness?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is a lot of uncertainty right now. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's unclear when or if the SEC regulations will come on. There's significant uncertainty around several of the California rules and how those will be implemented and understood by the market. And so there are a lot of challenges in getting ready for all of this stuff when, frankly, we don't know what all the rules are going to be yet. I think the key takeaway and the key thing for companies to do is to start thinking about the team they'll put together. Start putting together a cross-functional steering team to deal with this stuff, because it's not something that can be handled just by sustainability reporting folks. It's not something that can just be handled by financial reporting folks. It's something that really requires a wider swath of stakeholders internally, and that frankly requires buy-in at high, if not the highest levels of an enterprise, given the focus that investors and otherwise put on this disclosure. In doing that, it's important to start thinking about, well, how are we going to collect this data? What controls are we going to put in place, and how are we going to make it all assurable? Because I just said a lot, right? Like there's a lot of stuff coming online, but a lot of it also overlaps. In particular, a lot of the climate disclosure requirements. And so thinking about this stuff early and starting to put in place processes to gather that data will support reporting under a number of these different regimes, and hopefully allow companies to do so in an efficient and sort of reproducible way, as well as to allowing them to make sure they're kind of telling the same story to everyone everywhere. And Michael, I know you have thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And maybe I'll just, and we're talking about uncertainty, I'll just quickly jump in a little bit on the EU side, because that's something that we're spending a lot of time talking to folks about. And, I think as you kind of also think about these topics, I think the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, and that it sounds like something Yogi Berra probably said, although I'm not sure he ever really said that. But just to shift to the EU political climate and the discussions there, we're finding really navigating the EU ESG regulatory environment is really a big challenge for companies. During the last term, the EU adopted a lot of legislation as part of the Green Deal. I think for this audience, the most significant single piece of legislation is probably CSRD, which you've talked about a lot, Mark. And there are calls to push back or soften CSRD. And those calls are getting a little bit louder because, as Mark noted, compliance is coming up quickly on CSRD. But, at this point, I think it's fair to say that those calls are largely very early stage. They're unfocused. So I think it's premature for companies to slow down their CSRD preparation. And for U.S. companies, most of which are really just getting started with their their CSRD compliance. They're just starting to ramp up. I think it's important for those companies to continue to ramp up on their CSRD compliance. I doubt CSRD is going to be paused in full. I think it's more likely we might see some changes around the margin, if at all. I think we could see a further delay on sector-specific standards. That's something that we already have seen. Those have gotten pushed back a bit, although not eliminated. I think we could also see potentially an extension of the grace period on value chain reporting. So, there's a lot of challenges to reporting on the value chain. I could see that potentially getting pushed back further over time, although I don't think that's going to happen soon. And then I think, there's discussion and there's, a provision in CSRD, to consider flipping from a limited assurance to a reasonable assurance standard. And I could see that getting pushed back or potentially even being taken off the table for the foreseeable future, just because of all the challenges that's going to present for not only companies, but assurance providers as well. Looking beyond CSRD, I think, more broadly, what we're going to see over the next few years is a more pragmatic approach to rolling out the EU Green Deal. I think we're going to see more economic and geopolitical security pragmatism that's going to be injected into the process. And we're already seeing that, change in tone in the recommendations from the recent Draghi report, which was prepared by Mario Draghi. We're seeing it articulated in Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's proposed work plan for the Commission for the next several years. And we're also seeing it in calls by many national politicians as well. And I think a recent example of this pragmatism is the delay of the EU deforestation regulation.
Really helpful. I guess there are a couple of things. Obviously, I guess maybe just to focus on Europe a little bit, do you see some of the headwinds that have at least started to make noise? Do you see that there's going to be a change in some of the areas that the EU will be focusing on, or is there still motion to some regulation developments that they're thinking about beyond just what you mentioned? And then I think the other component obviously will be, how do companies in the U.S. kind of manage some of those European requirements? What the expectation will be from them. Obviously, the timeline will be extended, and how do they take them into consideration of not only the U.S. regulations that are happening or at the state level as well, but also from an investor standpoint. There's obviously a bit of balance that's happening there. But maybe I guess to start circling back to what I originally asked is really around the EU, kind of where are some of the other focus areas? Do you see things maybe do you see the headwinds maybe growing, or do you think that there is still momentum behind a lot of what has been discussed?
Sure. So I do think, those are all good questions. I mean, I think that, there is still momentum. There are some headwinds, but I think the discussion in the EU around sustainability topics, it's a question of degree. So it's a very different discussion than you see in the US, which is in some respects more binary, whether particular topics are appropriate for regulation or not. So it is a different approach by and large, and different way to look at it. I don't think we're going to see a lot of new sustainability related regulations coming out of the EU. I mean, there was a very, very ambitious agenda under the Green Deal. A lot of that got done during the last parliament. The parliament has moved to the right somewhat. The national governments have moved to the right somewhat. So I think we're probably not going to see as much new regulation. I think the focus is really going to be on implementation of existing regulation. In terms of some of the regulations that are the most focused to companies and investors, and obviously this is very broad brush because every investor has the things they care about. Every company has things that are specific to their business in their industry. But there's a handful that I would say just kind of come up over and over and over again in conversations with investors and with companies. I think from the investor side, as well as probably the company side, currently overall, CSRD is the biggest focus. It's the biggest focus from the company side just because of the amount of work that's required, which Mark went through before. And I think from the investor side, CSRD is important just because of the transparency nature of CSRD. It's going to provide investors with a lot more information than they've ever had around sustainability matters in a much more structured way. Not all of that information will be material to investment decisions, but certainly there's a lot of information that investors will provide useful and other stakeholders will provide useful as well. And then for investors, CSRD disclosures feed into some of their disclosure requirements under SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which was adopted a few years ago. So that's on the disclosure side. On the substantive side, I think there's what investors are most focused on is how pending EU Green Deal requirements are going to impact companies. And there's 4 substantive requirements that come up most frequently in the conversations that we have with investors and with companies. So first is Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, and that's going to require companies to take steps to assess and address a broad range of human rights and environmental impacts in their own operations and their value chains, and that's going to start to kick in 2027. Then there's the EU Deforestation Regulation, which I briefly mentioned before. That's going to require products across a number of different industries that are imported into the EU to be deforestation free within the meaning of that regulation. So it picks up commodities and products containing rubber, soy, paper products, among other things. And that's been pushed back for a year, but that now takes effect end of 2025. There's the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and that's a carbon tariff on certain carbon intensive products that are imported into the EU. So things like steel and cement, and that's already in the reporting phase. The tariff phase kicks in the next couple of years. And then there's extended producer responsibility legislation. So that's going to shift responsibility of a product's life cycle to the producer, including design, take back, recycling, and final disposal. And those regulations are just starting to ramp up now. So I think there's 3 takeaways here for companies. On the substantive regulations, first, I think it's important to know which requirements affect you and how. So, you're subject to the regulation, or are you, do you have a commercial counterparty who's subject, and therefore that's going to place obligations on you as a company. I think you need to be able to coherently communicate how the regulations and requirements affect you to your investors, and whether that's in one-on-one communications or that's in your broader based sustainability reporting. And then I think that you want to make sure, just to shift it back to the US for US based companies, I think you want to make sure that you appropriately convey risks and costs of emerging regulations in your SEC disclosure where that's material to do so.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the points that you raised there are really interesting, right? The comment around how Europe is more around a degree of disclosure in terms of headwinds, whereas in the U.S. it's a bit more binary. And I think what's interesting is obviously and I mentioned it at the top, we would talk a little bit about the anti-ESG movement or the pushback on ESG in the United States. The degree of which companies have to navigate both these expectations from a regulatory standpoint, particularly out of Europe, and then also some of the pushback that we're seeing in the U.S., both from a regulatory standpoint as well as stakeholder pushback. Just curious for your thoughts on the impact that it's had on companies today. It has, some of this pushback had an impact on your clients and in your observations. What are you seeing? How are you seeing companies kind of navigate some of that?
Sure. Well, it's not an ESG discussion if we don't also talk about anti-ESG, right? Both sides of the coin. So, the principal impact, I think, on most companies is that it's resulted in them being more thoughtful in their ESG communications, and that's frankly not a bad thing as a general matter, because sustainability reporting has gotten too voluminous and too unfocused over the last several years. But we're not seeing, what is often referred to as green hushing, where companies just aren't really saying anything about what they're doing. I think, again, I think companies are just getting more thoughtful in what they're doing. In terms of programmatic focus, I really haven't seen much of a shift. Although there certainly is more sensitivity to differing views on some ESG topics, on DE&I in particular. But for all companies, I think that the bottom line is, irrespective of anti-ESG pressures, your sustainability initiatives do need to be consistent with your mission, with your culture, and with your values. Because if they're not, I think you're really just setting yourself up for failure as a company.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think the one thing I would add there, Michael, is also it has to tie it to your business strategy and
Right.
performance. And I think, regardless of, obviously, some of this pushback we've received has really been a bit more vocal, but you could make the argument that it's not much different than the encouragement that we saw a few years ago on some of these initiatives, right? Where companies were really pushed into, whether it was making a commitment or making some sort of statement that maybe internally they hadn't fully vetted with, Mark, to your comment, with the conference of the parties within a company, to make sure everyone was aligned and understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve, and does it actually make sense from a business standpoint. And I think that this pushback we've received has really encouraged companies to really relook at that and really assess, to make sure that we are being strategic, and in some ways this just strengthens, I think, Michael, like you said, strengthens some of that disclosure, which has kind of gone a little bit of in multi directions over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and another thing on the ESG backlash here, we've been helping clients navigate this, and never has this been more obvious in DE&I, right? So we've actually seen a lot more companies publicly announce that they're scaling back their DE&I programs. So that's one salient effect. What are Michael, I hear you on premature, it might be premature to react, but seeing lately this slew of companies announcing so publicly that they're scaling back on DE&I, how do you really think folks should be thinking about this or processing this development right now?
Sure. We won't wade into the substantive debate over DE&I today, and that's a whole other topic. But I think there's two drivers that we're seeing here that have been relevant to recent trends. Is one, this is certainly an area where there's very different views among societal constituencies. And second, last year's Supreme Court case involving race-based considerations in college admissions has been a big factor. And even though that case doesn't apply to the private sector, I think that's too simplistic a way to look at it. And certainly it's being used by parties, by analogy, and also to, advance some of the same general legal principles into the private sector. But I think also, it's an important point to make that, at least in some cases, I think that the media reports regarding programs being dismantled have been simplistic or overblown. When you dig into some of the details of what the companies have actually said, in some cases, it's more of a recalibration of their program to better advance the company's DE&I goals rather than scrapping their program. And it's been a jettisoning of program elements that on closer examination maybe weren't that effective, in the context of what the company was trying to achieve. And the bottom line is, I think that this is an area where companies just need to be thoughtful in their approach and their messaging, and to bring it around to today's topic. I think it is going to continue to be a big focus of investor and other stakeholder engagement over the course of the next year. So it is an area where companies have to continue to be very thoughtful.
Yeah, it's definitely been a hot topic lately. Greg, Joe, I'm wondering if you're seeing it similarly, and what your thoughts are on how companies respond to that pushback, and relatedly, if you've seen companies getting feedback on these issues from the institutional investors.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, yes, in terms of companies, we are seeing it similarly. And I think it's to your point, it's not just DEI that we've seen it. We've seen it on some of the sustainability as well, where there's kind of a re-examination of some targets, and it's not necessarily companies walking away from certain initiatives, but it's more refocusing, recalibrating where they think they may have some greater impact. And I think what's really important is that level of transparency that companies are providing around that rationale, and that's a balance of what do you put in the public domain, what do you put when having those discussions with institutions, and how do you balance some of that so that way you can really make sure that, again, going back to a previous point that was raised of kind of trying to mitigate the risk of that narrative as best as possible. I think interestingly, what we're also seeing, so there are a couple of campaigns that I think we're also familiar, at least with Robbie Starbuck, that's pushed on some of the anti-DEI initiatives. We've also seen a couple of hedge funds or smaller investors that have been focused on questioning ESG metrics or ESG initiatives, as well as ESG compensation, and asking for engagements with companies around seeking to understand why is it that companies are focusing on, in their words, non-financial focus areas on when they should be prioritizing financial metrics. But what's interesting is that certain institutional investors are also starting to ask some of these questions, not from the standpoint of we don't agree with this, but more trying to understand the rationale for some of these objectives, both a pullback on a target, or I'm sure Joanne can talk more around the ESG and compensation component, but really seeking to understand the company's perspective. Also, I think seeking to understand what type of, what they've been hearing, what feedback have they been receiving from some of these individuals in the space, because, on top of issuers having to manage this scrutiny, we also have to remember a lot of institutional investors also are receiving some of the same scrutiny, right? These are large organizations that are put in the limelight just like a lot of our issuers are. And so they also have to manage understanding how can they control that narrative in terms of how are they addressing the issue, working with their portfolio companies to make sure that they're being strategic in their approach and really balancing that. So I think that's something that we're going to see unfold more this coming fall during engagement, and certainly something we'll see leading into the year, just around those conversations, probably some enhancements to disclosures to better, strengthen that relationship and, the relationship between the initiative and the company's objectives, and trying to mitigate some of that pushback that we've seen. And Joanne, like I mentioned, I think the compensation component has been a hot target. So maybe we can jump into that a little bit.
Yeah, the obvious pain point currently, right? Yeah, I mean, realistically speaking, on the space of ESG metrics represented in compensation plans, which has really been driven really by, the investor community asking for this in the past few years. I mean, if you look at the Russell 3000, about 2021, back in 2021, there are about 10% of them have some kind of ESG metrics in their pay program. By today, you're looking at that number at around 30% level. So in S&P 500, 2021, they were, 22% had them in their pay programs. In 2024, today, as we stand, 75% has it. So, if you look at just the CAGR alone across these two broad indices, you're looking at an uptake of about 35% CAGR of companies choosing to do this. So really, the truth of the matter is this is going to be at the forefront of your boardroom discussions when you look at total rewards design, right? Our colleagues in Ropes and Gray know that, while the U.S. affirmative action ruling may not really encroach on the corporate space, but this is actually causing noise and complications right now, right? I mean, so that brings us to on the compensation lens, right? We're coming out of a major election year. And I echo Michael's point of view that it may be a little bit premature right now to react because timing wise we are coming out of a major election year. But it may be diligent to review and take a fresh look on our plan design at the standpoint of balancing what Greg has spoken about, how your investors are looking at this. And also with this much uptake on D&I think there's already a widespread buy-in, right? There's little dispute that businesses thrive when your people thrive, right? So, and also we have to stay competitive as we're reshaping as all these mega trends are reshaping, the compositions and skills needed for the future workforce. So, you know, maybe right now it may be worth asking if we're to reframe the question really, what does DNI really look in your workplace and what should it really look like, right? Widen that diversity aperture be beyond gender and race. Perhaps it's looking at really a human capital dimension, retention, attrition, talent development, upskilling, culture. Your investors are also looking at it in that lens because these are alpha generating factors for them, and that is going to inform their investment allocations as well and long-term strategies. So Greg brought out a great point. If you're having this lively discussions in your boardrooms, in your total rewards group, in your legal departments as well, that's the whole point of a shareholder engagement strategy and program as well. Bring that conversation over to your investor space because they're also grappling with this. And, having lived on that investor space for some time, executive compensation really resides at a very unique intersection in corporate governance. It's that unique toolkit that investors use to kind of directly express their views. It's a direct lever to drive a company's performance and their opinions on the company's strategy. So it will always be used actively. In that point of view, that I appreciate the conundrum we are now, but we are also at this crossroads where we can use all the intangible value of having a conversation with our investors to help shape that, whatever that future decision might look like.
That's great. Just being cognizant of time, I know we have a couple of questions that have come through, so maybe we can start with the Ropes and Gray team. You obviously ran through a number of regulatory developments, but also there is one that we've heard a little bit about related to California and some of I think it's child labor related. So curious if you may be able to provide an update on that.
Sure. And so the good news is, I think relative to everything that we've been talking about, that's a pretty easy one. So it's a disclosure only law, and also it's very limited in its approach. So what it requires companies to do is that if they have voluntarily conducted a social compliance audit, they have to disclose the findings of that audit relating to child labor and their business. And there's a whole bunch of kind of specific things under the statute that have to be disclosed. But the bottom line is that it doesn't create new obligations on companies other than the disclosure obligation. So there's no requirement to conduct a social compliance audit or a child labor audit if it's not something that a company would otherwise be doing. The other thing I'll just mention on that piece of legislation, like a lot of state level legislation, it's very short. It's written in very broad strokes. So I think there's a lot of interpretive questions that come up under it, but the stuff we'll leave for another day in another forum. So.
Great, thanks. I think maybe we'll take one more and then we can kind of maybe tie it to concluding thoughts. But and maybe we could incorporate this into our points, because I think there's two questions that are good. One is are there really any topics or considerations companies should really take into consideration that we haven't already talked about over the next, whether it's through engagements or leading into 2025, that really should be top of mind? And maybe also too, we can weave in another question around, given that we've talked about it, this is an election year, issuers were very engaged in last year's election cycle. Are you hearing companies are planning to do something similar, or are they being quiet? I know from our standpoint, we're certainly suggesting that they not be as vocal as they were last time around, but maybe we can include that observation as well in the question. So with that, maybe I can just go around the room and ask for thoughts on what to prepare for the coming year, and some closing thoughts as well. So.
Sure, and I can, if you want, Greg, I can start off on that one. So, we briefly hit on it, but I think one topic that we didn't discuss in much detail is that I think supply chains are going to continue to be an increasing area of focus for investors. Now, that's a much broader topic than just ESG, but within ESG, it picks up human rights, labor rights, environmental sustainability, among other things. And your second point, I think is a really important one that you mentioned, which is that, we're spending a lot of time talking to companies and senior management teams, boards about this, is, companies are really grappling with how to navigate corporate speech. And I think it's a really hard balance to strike. There's no single approach here that fits for all companies. I mean, I think the only, kind of common denominator it does have to be genuine for a particular company for it to work.
I'm happy to go next. So I think I would, we've touched on a lot of different topics today. We have not, despite everything we've touched on, covered the full universe of ESG stuff companies need to think about going into next year. And so I think really the key takeaway from my perspective is that when you're thinking about these issues, you need to think about them in kind of a holistic way, starting from building up your team internally, as I said earlier, making sure you have sort of all of the stakeholders engaged, thinking about areas where you have internal expertise and manpower, and areas where, frankly, you don't, and where you might need to bring in an external consultant to, for example, help do your double materiality analysis under CSRD, which is a real world example we're working with a number of clients on. And really trying to think about, well, how am I going to get all of this data together in a comprehensive, understandable way that will ultimately be assurable and that can be efficiently used to produce disclosure across a number of different regimes. I think the days of kind of siloing ESG disclosure within kind of just the sustainability team, though they, remain, a key, if not the key constituency internally, and kind of doing it by, sending around Excel spreadsheets and Word documents in an uncoordinated manner are kind of coming to an end here. And that companies, if they want to do this in an efficient and effective way, are going to need to really start centralizing those processes and building cross-functional teams to do it.
Mark, let me dovetail you on that siloing. So let me offer a bit of a compensation lens and shifting the gears a bit as we close out. One thing we haven't mentioned was, at this time of the year, ISIS just released their their policy vote results just about 4 days ago. That represents about 300 respondents, and between ISIS and Glass Lewis, it tells you, you can glean from there, investor scrutiny on compensation still remains. They're now looking a bit more into vesting periods of equity grants. They're looking at, AI, cyber incidences, the possibility of cross-company accountability of your directors. They're looking at performance-based, time-based compensation and discretionary awards. So really, the scrutiny still remains, and right now it's a great time to get to know your investors and get to know what's meaningful for them. hit it while it's hot, and then that's how we're able to create a better game plan to proceed with next year. Greg, anything on the shareholder space?
Yeah, I think echo everything everyone has said. We obviously, can reiterate and have experienced many of those things. But I would say the last thing is that I'd like to just stress here is that I really feel like the engagement process is an opportunity for issuers to, assuming they don't have a contentious issue that they have to deal with, try and get out ahead. Speak to your institutions to understand what they're looking for as we're kind of transitioning to this, these expectations from a regulatory standpoint. Certainly these are things that we have to work towards, and I think everyone understands that some of these developments are going to change the landscape in terms of disclosures in some ways. But even if not, seek to understand what it is that maybe some of those steps your institutions would be looking for, so that you can stay out ahead, prepare them for some issues if you foresee some of those topics becoming more difficult to address in the future, whether or not it becomes a regulatory development or not, and try and be proactive from that standpoint. I think this is an opportunity for us to really take advantage of that before we put our heads back down for the proxy season that'll be here before we unfortunately know it or would like for it to be. So with that, I would really like to thank everyone for joining this webinar. We really appreciate everyone's time today. Special thank you to Michael and Mark and Ropes and Gray for joining us today on this conversation. We know we just touched the surface on a lot of these topics, but we're always available to anyone if you have follow-up questions. And again, thank you for your time, and we hope this has been informative for you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for including us.